Good afternoon. My name is Susan Saab Fortney, and I'm a professor at Texas A&M University School of Law. And I'm honored today to moderate this session on teaching professional responsibility online. We actually started this discussion in August with 3 of the 4 panelists, and the AALS PR section leadership asked us to continue the discussion with a focus on best practices in teaching PR. And as far as best practices, I think it's noteworthy at the outset to recognize that best practices will change somewhat depending on what you're teaching. That point was made in the session earlier today as part of the meeting. There was a discussion of best practices, and as one of the deans noted, it's not one size fits all. It largely depends on what you're teaching, and that's why in this session we're focusing on what has worked and not worked for the panelists in their teaching of professional responsibility. So for this discussion, we're fortunate to have 4 experienced professors who've worked online for some period of time. I'll introduce them in terms of their alphabetically. So we'll start with Alberto Bernabe, UC, University of Illinois, Chicago, John Marshall School of Law. Second, we have Susan Carl from American University there. She is a vice dean at the Washington College of Law. Peter Joy, many of you know, is the Peter Hitchcock Professor and Vice Dean at the Washington University School of Law. And the 4th person, alphabetically speaking, is Margaret Tarkington, Indiana University, Robert McKinney School of Law. And what our game plan is for each of the panelists, the presenters, to spend about 5 minutes briefly sharing their experience, what they've done, and then we'll turn to more of a roundtable approach. And there we'll look at best practices in different areas such as organization, assessment, technology. And what we've done rather than a PowerPoint is to prepare an outline of best practices, which is posted with this session, and I understand you'll be able to access that after this session. That document also includes select readings related to online teaching. I know that people have been bombarded with trainings and materials on online teaching, and these are 4 pieces and links to them that may be helpful. And as far as those pieces, there's one in particular you might note. It's a forthcoming article in the Journal of Legal Education. So with that background, I'll also ask you to post any questions on the chat, and we're going to tackle as many as possible. And let's go ahead and move into our presenters. And the first presenter is actually Margaret, who will share her approach to teaching online in an asynchronous format. So Margaret.
Hi, everybody. Well, I'm going to actually share my screen here and show my Canvas course. So I started teaching in 2016. I started my first foray into online with professional responsibility. And you can see for me, I use a learning management system. I use Canvas. And my main thing is to make it highly organized so your students know exactly what they're doing and it's easy to follow. And they're also, so I just wanted you to actually see the course. You're probably all familiar with modules, but you can see that for every week of the semester, they can easily go and see where they're supposed to be by the date. And then all of the assignments and all of the lecture videos and anything that they do are found in that week's work. Additionally, the very first page of the first thing under every week is an instruction page that has the complete instructions for the whole week so that every student knows exactly what they need to do for that week. Now this also, in looking at the instruction page, each of these link to the actual assignment or lecture video that is associated with it. I actually tell my students exactly how long the lecture videos are. So they know in advance, oh, I have to do this reading assignment and I'm going to have to watch this lecture video, and they can see how long that's going to be. And sometimes it's really short. Like you can see these introductory videos on the Spalding case are just 5 minutes and 2 minutes. And then the next little section is 8 and 10. And that's actually something that you can do with asynchronous learning that's wonderful, is that you can tailor reading assignments to the lecture videos very tightly, and have short reading assignments that then are tailored to short video lessons, and have those basically intertwined together, and in a very different way than you would do a live class. So live class, you have a big reading assignment, and then you have a long lecture. And for me, for the asynchronous, it works really well to have a whole bunch of short reading assignments with then very narrowly tailored video lessons about them. You also have just some opportunities to create assignments that you haven't, that was not actually the one I wanted to select, sorry, done before. So after I have my students as their first assignment, watch a little introduction to what we learn about in professional responsibility. And then I have them do an assignment, and the assignment is to actually articulate their own personal understanding of professional responsibility in 100 to 300 words at the very beginning of the semester. And then after we finish the whole semester, they do that same assignment again once we've talked about it and they've learned more about it. And usually they tend to think they know what they're going to cover at the beginning and are really surprised at how much it's grown. But that personalizes the subject matter for them and makes it so it's basically their own personal code or understanding of what professional responsibility is that they have come up with. I just want to give you a couple other examples of kind of what kind of tailoring you can do, that just as an example. So if you look in my 6th week, I cover attorney-client privilege, and you can see that my reading assignments here are really, really short. They read a couple pages and then they watch the lecture video, and then a couple pages about attorney-client privilege, just the one case, well, the introductory, and then a lecture video about it. Also, I often have an introductory lecture to a case. So I'll have a lecture that introduces Upjohn before they actually read it. So I can say, these are the things to look at in the lecture video. And again, we're talking about a couple minutes that you can do that in, and then they can read it, and then you can come and discuss it. So that's one of the things that I really love about this. The other thing just to mention is I have something due in this class, I did every Thursday and Saturday. This last year I did it every Wednesday, Saturday. And so I assess them every week on what they've read and what they've done. And that way I know if they're doing the materials. I usually use quizzes and discussion questions, but they get feedback from me every single week on what they're doing. So that's just an introduction to my course.
All right.
Sorry.
Alberto?
First of all, let me unmute myself. And hello and welcome everybody. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me and hear me. This is what has been my classroom since March. I am sitting exactly where and how I have been teaching since then. We have a lot to talk about, and there's a lot that we could talk about, so let me get right to it. I will start by mentioning a couple of things that I think are probably pretty obvious to everybody by now, given the experience this semester. And that is that there are different ways to teach online, and each has advantages and disadvantages. And it really all starts with the first important decision, and that is whether to choose to teach asynchronously or synchronously or some sort of combination. And what I do in my course is a combination. There are some topics that I cover totally asynchronously. I assign the material to the students and have them hand in short written assignments. And I feel comfortable that they can cover that material on their own with my feedback on those assignments. But for most of the semester, I combine some of the elements that Margaret just mentioned as part of her asynchronous class with synchronous teaching. I have my class meet by Zoom, like we would if we were in the classroom. And then in order to prepare for each one of those classes, I assign 3 different types of assignments. I assign something to read, something to watch, and something to do, very similar to what Margaret was describing. The something to read is the type of reading that we would assign normally in a classroom setting, readings from a casebook and the rules. They are shorter, but they cover the material, of course. There's something to watch are short pre-recorded lectures in which I summarize general principles or give a short introduction to a subject or tell the students what to look for or emphasize in the assigned material. And the important thing here is that the pre-recorded lectures should not be, and are not for me, a substitute for the classroom session. They're only a preview. They're very short, 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the most, on what students should look for and prepare for. And so I think of them as coming attractions for the main feature. Finally, the something to do aspect of the assignment is a short exercise that I give the students so they can assess themselves as to how well they understand the material after they do the reading and watch the recorded lecture, but before we go to the Zoom class, so that if the assessment makes them realize they need to fill in some gaps, we can go over that when we get together. Most of the time, this type of assignment is a group of short answer questions that I call questions for class discussion, because that's what they are, what they're meant to be. These are the questions that I expect that we will be able to discuss in class. Then when we get together by Zoom, I use that time to answer questions that the students might have, to go over those assessment questions, and maybe emphasize 1 or 2 things, but not cover everything that was assigned, because a lot of it they probably can cover on their own, given the material that was assigned to prepare. Now, one thing that didn't work as well as I thought last semester was that originally I planned that the Zoom classes would be shorter than a typical classroom class, which for me would be an hour and a half. But last semester, most classes lasted longer than I expected. In fact, most of them lasted almost the whole hour and a half. And many did last the whole hour and a half. All right, I think that is a good summary of what I do. I'll be happy to go back to any of this when we talk about best practices. If you have questions, put them in the chat. Feel free to email me later if you want to, also after the session. So I will leave it at that and move it along.
Thank you, Alberto. So Peter.
Great. Great to be here. And as Alberto said, I hope everybody can see and hear me. I developed an online LLM professional responsibility course now, gosh, it's almost 10 years ago. And that had both asynchronous and synchronous components. I met twice a week with the students, and there is asynchronous content along the lines that both Margaret and Alberto have talked about. This semester, I'll be teaching the legal profession, another name for professional responsibility course. For the first time, I'll be using Canvas as the learning platform and teaching via Zoom. And my course looks somewhat like Margaret, though I have to say I got some ideas just looking at Margaret's pages there. And I'd like to also talk about something about what other kinds of content can we use. And so for this, I'm going to share my screen so I could go over something linked to the textbook that I use. So let's see. All right, so I think everybody now should be seeing this screen. And so this particular textbook along with, it has multiple choice questions you could use, and this is what the students see, all the student resources. And one of the things that I developed for the textbook are the simulations, and I'm going to just go over a little bit with this one simulation to give you an idea, and I'm going to try to make sure that the sound will work on this too. So this is based on a storyline that I put together, and as I can tell now,
ethical
here we go.
practices. Assume that all the lawyers and clients have given informed consent to you being present, and that your work is a permitted exception to confidentiality pursuant to Rule 1.6b4 to secure legal advice about the lawyer's compliance with these rules. If you believe that an interaction between a lawyer and the client, between the lawyers, or a planned course of action violates a rule of professional conduct, you should click the violation button.
So I'm going to kind of
You've been
move
asked
through
to sit
this
in and observe lawyers
just so you could sort of
We're
see.
meeting with Mr. Adams today. He's a real estate developer, and he plans a mixed-use building for offices and apartments at the corner of State and Main. He told me over the phone
If the
that he
student
plans
were
to
to
buy the
think
old
that there
Cornette
was
building and the
violation,
adjacent parking
you'll
lot.
see.
He also wants help with permits for the project. Did you do the conflicts check like I asked?
Yes, I looked up the owners of the property, and we don't really represent any of them. Another partner in the firm did meet a few weeks ago with the parking lot owner who wants to purchase the Cornette building. The partner gave the parking lot owner some preliminary advice, but the owner has not returned the fee agreement letter with an advance on fees. If Adam hires us, all we have to do is have the firm send the parking lot owner a letter saying that we're not going to represent him.
Great. That sounds like a plan.
So,
What would the ethics violation be?
and there are 10 different ways that the student could express
Correct.
this, and then it gives them the information. So I'm going to stop the sharing here, but there are 5 of these. They build on a storyline. I try to work in as many different kinds of ethics violations as possible. It also develops that the law firm starts representing their client's son. So it's kind of involved, but it's an extra thing, can be assigned to the students. And in the interest of time, I'm going to pass this on to Susan Carl, who was afraid that we would all be going over, but I think we've all been going under.
Good job.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All good? Yes. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my course, and I do a lot of what other people do, but I'm just going to highlight one thing or a theme of the way I designed my course. So I developed this course well prior to the pandemic, and it was an experiment as a summer course. And what I wanted to do was combine our required PR course, which we call legal ethics at my school, with an opportunity for reflective learning for students who are working in summer legal positions. And what I wanted to try was to see if students might do their best thinking about legal ethics while they were immersed in an actual practice context. And I also wanted students to think about how practice context affects the ethics pressures they might be feeling and how those could vary depending on context. And I wanted them to really explore the broad range of practice contexts that would be available to them after graduation, because in my experience, students have a surprising lack of good knowledge about the legal profession in general. So I wanted them to learn from each other and to reflect on what they were learning where they were working over the summer. And I had online teaching experience because I had already designed and taught an ethics course for our Masters of Legal Studies program. And so I had some thoughts about what might work and what might not. And my organizing theme was I wanted to maximize the strengths of online learning and minimize the weaknesses. So there are a lot of strengths, and we've talked about some of them, but to me, the ones that were special about the way I designed my course, one was that you can really offer it to students anywhere, which is great because then students can be learning while they're actually in externships or summer jobs around the country and sometimes even around the world, that you can bring in expert speakers from anywhere around the country or around the world, and also that it's easy to ask students to create some of their own course content. And in my case, what I did was I asked them to create sort of mini ethnographies, to think hard, to create Zoom videos of interviews with subjects or lawyers who were practicing in various settings, and to explore ethics issues in a very general way that those lawyers faced in those settings. And then I had the students upload their videos, and the students were required to watch a certain number of each other's videos and to comment on them. So this required students to interview a lawyer, and it worked really well before the pandemic. During the pandemic, I taught this course as during the semester course. And I very soon realized that some students know a lot of lawyers and got these amazing people to come speak to them, their uncles, their mothers, their this is and that's. But some students didn't know any lawyers. And so what I did there was I asked them what practice area they were interested in, and then I connected them with an alum teaching in that area. And that worked out very well. Both the alums loved it, the students loved it, they made a professional connection. Plus we had this really rich set of sort of, live materials, of, original source materials. I use Ann Southworth and Catherine Fisk's excellent materials book, which is organized around a chapter for each kind of practice context. And so I bring in guest speakers to speak to each chapter, and then students would work in small groups to lead the class discussion and questioning of those speakers. And then the last thing I'd like to mention, the other thing I think is really great about online teaching is the small group stuff, and we'll talk more about that later. And I I use the Rode, Lubin, Cummings, and Engstrom version of the Valdez versus Alloway garage negotiations, which raises really fascinating ethics issues. And that's our final project. The students really look forward to it. They negotiate in small groups, and then they write reflection papers, and I grade those. So my overall assessment is this kind of course works really well for motivated, mature, organized learners. But if you've got students who don't have those learning skills, it can be a problem. And we're going to talk more about that later.
Thank you, Susan. Before we move to these different areas of best practice, I want to just have the group address a couple of the chat questions. One of them just asked about Margaret's class and asked, is your class, completely async, which it is. And Margaret, could you indicate how many students roughly are in your sections?
Well, ideally not too many, but I've taught it now several years, because again, my first time was in 2016, and I've had between 66 and 90 students in that class. 90 was really hard to keep up with all their weekly assignments and get feedback, but I did it. But that's a lot, but it was completely asynchronous. But it did require feedback to each student on those assignments every single week.
Right, and we'll talk more. Thank you, Margaret. We'll talk more about assessment and providing feedback, particularly in these larger classes when we get to best practices. Another quick question for Peter related to the software that you use to create those scenarios. Could you, again, tell us what software it was?
Yeah, that was done with a team that West Publishing had. So I didn't have the software. I created the storyboards basically, and really I learned how to do that. And then I'd send them the storyboards, and they would do sketches and ask me if that conformed with what I wanted, and I'd say yes. So it was an organization or a group called Six Red Marbles. But it wasn't software that I had to do it from scratch. I wish I knew how to do that. I probably would have my own company.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So let's go ahead and move to these different areas of best practice, starting with planning and general observations on the structure of the course. So Peter's going to lead that discussion.
Yeah, I think Margaret's Canvas page is a pretty good example of putting all of the planning up front. And it's really important, I think, to have everything spelled out, using your syllabus to make sure all the expectations are crystal clear, including the Zoom etiquette. Also, it's important to be realistic about the number of assignments and features that we can effectively include that can be handled by students as well as us. And so, as Margaret said, when she had 90 students, that makes some of what she wants to do a little bit more challenging. It's also important as you add asynchronous content. If you take the course that you've been teaching normally and then you add a lot of asynchronous content to it, you have to make an adjustment. And that adjustment is either reducing the number of pages for readings that you've assigned or reduce the length of the synchronous class sessions. I know Alberto thought that was going to happen, that he found out that it didn't. But I think you need to make some adjustments along the way. It's also, I think, really important, whether you're doing this online or in person, not to change what your expectations are in terms of course requirements and assessment. I was vice dean for a while, and nothing drives students up the wall like a professor who announces an open book exam and then changes it to closed book, or closed book to open book, or 3 hours to 5 hours. It drives them crazy. I know that Susan mentioned that the key points are all in a handout. So I think I'm going to stop right here, see if Susan wants to add anything to this so we can move along through the agenda.
Susan, Carl, you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, I just have a couple of things to add. One, in my experience as vice dean, it's so easy to think that more is better, because it's so easy to add more and all this enrichment stuff that's so great, but students do not appreciate it. They have many courses going on at the same time. So I really think that for everything you add, you have to subtract something is very, very important. And also to consider having shorter synchronous classes. Maybe if you have a large class, so I had in a different course, not ethics, but I had a large section and it was a 2-hour class twice a week. And so instead of, I had an hour of async material and then an hour of synchronous material, and I taught it twice so that there could be discussion in both classes. I found it really, really helpful to seek anonymous feedback from my students kind of early on in the semester, because I think one of the weaknesses of online teaching is we don't really know how students are experiencing things. And so students were telling me things that were helpful and made the course better. And so I think those are the two things I want to add.
Very good, thank you. And then just from the standpoint of less is more, I mean, that was something that I experienced, and it was also reflected in my evaluations from this last semester, where I tried to be inclusive and provide different opportunities, and from the standpoint of group work and individual group and optional exercises. And one of the comments was, too many optional exercises. You think about it, the gunner types think they have to do all the optional exercises. So I think that is something I'm going to remember going forward. So thank you, Susan. And we're going to move now into the area of content and presentation. You got a little, I think, glimpse of that in terms of Margaret's Canvas arrangement and the way she uses the learning management system. Many schools are using Canvas. But Margaret, would you take the lead on that section, please?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say about using learning management systems is get the training you need to do it. When I was initially approached about doing an online professional responsibility class, which was for the same kind of reasons that I think Susan discussed, that there were students who were doing things away, who wanted to take professional responsibility while they were somewhere else. And so there was actually quite a desire for it, since it's a required course. I had never used Canvas. I was unfamiliar with Zoom. It was 2016, so some of you might remember back then. And it was all new. And I met with our Center for Teaching and Learning on our campus. I actually, kind of funny, didn't meet with those on our campus, but since I work for Indiana University, I ended up working with the CTL from the Bloomington campus via Zoom. So I got an online training for my online course, but it was really important to get that training and learn how to actually utilize it. And so I would recommend, I had no tech savvy, you don't have to have tons of tech savvy. You can learn how to use it. So that's the first thing, is get the training you need to actually use it correctly. I already talked about the organization and segmenting, and for professional responsibility especially, that is so useful, I have found. Another example is just with confidentiality. You, instead of assigning all of the reading on confidentiality and then having an hour-and-a-half lecture on confidentiality and its exceptions, you can just break it up and have a short little video on each of the exceptions combined with reading tailored to each of those exceptions. And then there are just some, I found that there are some opportunities to link things that for students that normally I wouldn't have done in a live class. So I also do an assignment where they go to the Judges and Lawyers Assistance Programs page, and there's a link to that, and they look at the assessment tools that are offered there, and that's an assignment for them to look at it when we talk about those mental health and substance abuse issues, and also a link to the ABA toolkit, which is not something, I might mention that in class, but it's just easier doing that, at least for me, online. You can have a link there, they have to go there, they have to respond to it as an assignment. And so I also have formative assessments that I weave into, and they can be very short. You can just have a few questions on the quiz just to make sure that they're understanding the basic concepts of the course. Now, Alberto, did you want to have some things or Susan and Alberto, I think, are both going to talk about some other things on this?
Yeah, I have a few things on learning management systems. Remember that, of course, there are many different ones, and you might be limited to which one you have to use. Margaret uses Canvas. I use Blackboard, and I think and I agree with her 100% that the two important things is to learn how to use it, number one, and to make it clear and clean and easy to user friendly if you have a home page for the students to look at. Another thing that is important in terms of both content and what we do in the class is frequent feedback. We've talked about that. It's very important. It can be quizzes, it can be questions, it can be preparation for class, whatever it is, but frequent feedback for the students, because the students are going to feel like they're studying a lot on their own, and you need to be there virtually to help them along. For the pre-recorded lectures, there's a couple of points that I always try to remember, and that is that it's a good idea to use images and videos and pictures and whatever, but when you do, remember to be inclusive and remember to be creative in the type of images. I actually recommend that you try to avoid pictures of people and just be creative with other kinds of images. But if you're going to use people, don't use all white men or stereotypes of other sorts. And one thing to think about, I don't have the answer for this, but one thing that we all need to think about when we do pre-recorded lectures is whether we are going to allow the students to download and keep those lectures, or whether we're going to allow them to post them to social media and YouTube or whatever. It may be that if you don't have control over your pre-recorded lectures, you may find them later in other sources that you don't want to. So that's something to keep an eye on. In terms of synchronous classes, there are disadvantages to synchronous classes, and one of them is obvious, is that you depend on the technology, and if the technology doesn't work well, then you need to have a plan B to figure out what happens when there are internet connectivity issues or audio problems or video problems or whatever it is. Always have an alternative to do something to be able to connect with the students. One of the good things about Zoom, we mentioned this briefly, is that it gives you the opportunity to have guest speakers, and whenever you can, I advise that it's a good idea to try to find people that might be interesting to have talk to the students. I've had bar counsel from a different state, lawyers who represent lawyers in disciplinary proceedings, and so on. And regarding that, the same concern that I said before, make sure that you're inclusive. Don't have only prosecutors. If you're going to have prosecutors, try to have a defense lawyer. If you're going to have a private practice lawyer, have a government lawyer. Make sure they're not all, you don't invite only male lawyers, and so on and so forth. And the last thing I think I'm going to mention is the chat function. If you're teaching a class synchronously, think ahead and keep an eye on how the chat is working for you. Sometimes it becomes an obstacle, and sometimes it gets in the way of being able to teach effectively. Students may start using it to chat with each other and not pay attention and whatever. So just keep an eye on that and decide how it works better for you, and consider if it doesn't work for you, maybe you can limit the use to communicate with you during class, if that's a better choice. Those are some things. So, Susan, back to you.
All right, thank you. And let me ask before we move on, Susan, Carl, did you have anything you wanted to add about non-class speakers? Anything?
No, I think Alberto covered it well.
Okay, very good. You know, the one observation I have on non-class speakers is also deciding, if you're in a synchronous class, do you want that particular visit, as we say in the South, that visit to be during the live class, or do you want it to be recorded? And if it is during the live class, then you just have to be mindful about trying to contain it in terms of a guest, because often the speakers love having the audience, and you may ask them to keep it down to 15 minutes, or you may try to contain it by making it a question answer format. But the next thing you know, it runs into a half hour. So just be aware of that. Then Susan, there is one question on the chat. Quickly, if you could indicate, what do you use to get the anonymous feedback?
Happy to answer that. And I have one other thing to just quickly comment on that comes out of something Alberto said. I actually use a research assistant, or teaching assistant, and she comes in and introduces herself, and she says to the students, she knows me well, and if the students feel more comfortable talking to her than to me about any complaints or concerns they have, or if they're uncomfortable approaching me, they can talk to my student. And then I also do a midterm evaluation, and they send all of their responses to her, and then she anonymizes it and gives it to me.
Okay, that's helpful.
I also wanted to just comment on this question about use of course recordings. So we're having a dickens of a time with that right now. I have some faculty members who are pushing back and saying they don't want to load their their courses. They don't want to load them for students to see again, and they're concerned. We say it's an honor code violation if a student uses a recording, either async or sync, for an unauthorized use. In other words, anything other than just studying for the course. But we've had problems where students have done, we have one problem where a faculty member refused to record something. The student recorded it on her phone and then provided it to other students who couldn't be at the session. And so I think we haven't completely figured out what the ethical way to handle all of this, the stuff we're creating in virtual reality around professor recordings.
Yeah, it's interesting. One person on chat just noted that depending on your school, something may really rise to the level of being an honor code violation. So an
In
interesting.
my school, yes.
Yeah, and so that's a concern as well. I mean, they're also on the chat. I'll note that there's some questions about the ABA guideline standard, which we're going to get to, and also just on this issue of chat. I mean, there is someone noted this ability for the students to chat just with the professor or with one another, and so keep those features in mind if you're using Zoom. You have that ability to limit it. And part of the idea of limiting is for there to be one conversation and not, and then the flip side is that if there is a chat, there's peer with peer learning. So there's a pro and con. Well, the heart of our best practices is really a discussion of engagement, which is our next area. So if you would, Alberto, be our engagement guru and lead that discussion.
Sure. And before I get to that, let me try to answer the question about how to get anonymous feedback. What I do that too, and what I use is Google Forms. Google Forms is very easy, and you just create a form with questions and give the students the link. And it can be done anonymously. They don't have to give the email or anything. So that's really easy to use. Okay, engagement. What we mean by that is the challenge of getting the students to really feel like they're part of the course, whether it's asynchronous or synchronous, that they are participating, that they're getting feedback, and all of that. Is obviously a very different topic when we talk about asynchronous and synchronous. And when it comes to this, some of the common ways in which we all have tried with some level of success to create engagement in classes include, for the asynchronous portion, creating discussion boards where students can participate and post questions or post answers or post comments and so on and so forth. Because I emphasize a little bit more synchronous, I don't emphasize discussion boards so much. So I think Margaret and Susan can speak to that a little bit more. I've used them, but not so much. What I did try to use one year, when we prepared the presentations, we said that as part of our best practices, it would be nice to also say some things about things that don't work, things that are not good practices. And I'll share one from my experience. The first time I taught the class online, I tried to use a listserv instead of a discussion board, and that didn't work at all. That was very problematic. The students didn't like it for many reasons. I can tell you more details later if you want to. But for whatever it's worth, between the two, a discussion board would work better than a listserv, in my opinion. In terms of synchronous teaching, engagement involves some of the more difficult questions for me. Starting with one that we have debated a lot in our school, and I've talked about with other people in other schools, and that is whether to require the students to keep their cameras turned on during class as a way for us to be able to see them and as a way for them to be able to be engaged, and for other reasons. There are obviously arguments in favor and against doing that. I tell my students that I want their cameras to be on. I want to be able to see them. I want to be able to talk to them and to see them when they talk to me and to each other. But I also tell them that if there's an issue, they can email me before class, and I will not object as long as I know beforehand. That's something that we can discuss further. I know there are some strong feelings about that topic. The other question about engagement in synchronous classes is whether to teach a synchronous class the way you teach a class in the classroom, whether you're going to be cold calling students and being Socratic and whatnot. I tend not to do that. I tend to be a little bit less formal on Zoom than I am in the classroom, but I do ask questions and I do expect the students to participate. And I try to encourage them to participate by using other ways. And the one that is my preferred one is to use polling, but not the polling that comes with Zoom. I actually use a program or a system called Poll Everywhere. There are others, but that's the one I use. And it allows me to pose questions to the group, and the students answer by going online and using their computer or their phone. And we can see the answers on the screen together in real time as the answers come in, and then talk about it as a group. I've gotten very good reviews about this. The students feel like they're part of the discussion without the feeling that everybody's looking at them, or that they're on camera all the time, and so on and so forth. And they can also use polling, and I tell them this, take the polling seriously, participate, because you can use it as a form of assessment. If you click on the wrong answer and then you follow the discussion and figure out why that was the wrong answer, you'll learn something. The other question is whether to use PowerPoint during a synchronous class, which is interesting. And I've learned in my experience something that I didn't expect. I never used PowerPoint in a classroom, but I've used it in a synchronous class. And I think it works well for a couple of reasons. One, because when you're doing that, it takes over the screen of the students, and the students feel less self-conscious about the fact that they are on screen. And it also allows me to highlight specific material, like Margaret says, looking at, little pieces of the rule in particular, or to use images to try to get points across. So there's a lot that we can do that is slightly different from what we would do in the classroom, to try to get the students interested, to try to keep their attention, and to try to get them to participate. So those are my thoughts on that. I think Peter may have some more ideas.
Yeah, I do. A couple things. When I teach in a regular classroom, I like to use a lot of simulations and role plays, having students be in the role of lawyers, sometimes the public. And I do that the same when I'm teaching online. Whenever there's somebody who's going to be the client, I always play that role, because that gives me more control over how the simulation unfolds. And depending on how the student is responding, or groups of students, I'm able to mix things up. I do also do some cold calling when I teach online. So I try to simulate what I'm doing online pretty close to the classroom. And I like to have what I call a panel of three. So students, in addition to me cold calling on some students, 3 students are designated for every class to be sort of the experts for that class. And I use them to sort of be the sounding board. I might call on a volunteer or cold call on a student, and then I'll ask the panel of 3 if they agree with that response, or if not, or I'll have them be a panel of appellate judges and have 2 students argue different sides of a problem. And I think a lot of this is all set to try to have the same level of engagement as we can have in a regular classroom. It is disconcerting looking at, especially if it's a large group, you might not have all the students on one screen, because it's going to have a limit of, I think, about 25 if you have a really big monitor. So it's a way of trying to have everybody as much involved as you can. And I think Susan Carl and also Susan Fortney have a couple other points that they might want to make. So how about Susan Carl?
Thank you, Peter. The point I want to make, and this is kind of a big point, and I don't think it's at all limited to PR, which is what I think the real weakness of online learning is that it expands the differential between students with privilege and those without. So students, as they try to take part in an online course, and can be in any situation. Some students are in very comfortable situations where there's lots of privacy and quiet, and it's easy for them to stay engaged. And then other students are in much more difficult situations. We had one student tell us that the only place she was home with her family, and the only place she could take part in classes was in the bathroom because that was the only place that was quiet. We had another student who turned her camera off because she had a family member actually, who was sort of parading around half dressed in the background, you know. So there's just, and then of course the problem of kids and all of that kind of thing. So I do think that we have to be extraordinarily sensitive to those problems with learning conditions in online teaching. And I, for one, will be very glad when everyone is sitting in a class in front of me and I can really gauge their, their level of engagement, because I can really see them all the time.
Susan, how about also sharing your experience more with breakout groups? I mean, what we see is that particularly as some students have gone back to the in-person format, what they miss is really chatting with one another, getting together, and the breakout groups gives them that opportunity, provided that they're managed in a way that's effective. So what has been your experience with breakout groups, Susan?
Well, I love using breakout groups. I used to use them a lot in ethics anyway, because I would assign hypos or role plays, and then, I would try to move around from group to group, which required me sort of like sometimes running from room to room in a negotiation, or at least, walking down the hall because they would become so noisy. So one of I think the strengths of online learning is that you can literally apparate from one room to another and just you sort of appear, and students can do a lot of small group discussion, and they seem to have a really good time with it. And I completely agree with you, Susan. It's also, they do catch up with each other a little bit and socialize a little bit. So I can't sing the praises of using the breakout function in Zoom enough.
Right. And I think when you do so, the trick is to do it in a way that is organized, that they have specific questions, that the questions are accessible to them. So that's one way that I use the discussion board, is that I post the questions for the breakout group on the discussion board. And then I ask that there be a reporter from each breakout group that then goes onto the discussion board and provides that group's experience with that and feedback on those particular questions. And then for inclusive teaching purposes, I ask the students to have a reporter who hasn't served in that capacity before. So that helps as well. And getting back to the feedback that I got from this last year, it was that breakout groups were their favorite thing, but to give more time. So getting back to this less, maybe more, is maybe you have fewer breakout groups, but you give them adequate time. So my other comment in terms of engagement is that Alberto had commented on his experience with discussion boards. I think the value of discussion boards in some ways is to also give students an opportunity to participate who feel less inclined to do so online. They may be shy online or even in person. And the discussion board provides that. So when I am weighting basically and evaluating course participation, I include postings that people make on the discussion board. So that's something to consider as well. Peter, before we move on, did you want to say something about students checking out more and what you've done some in terms of large classes?
If you have a really large class and you've built in asynchronous content, another thing you could do is break the class into smaller components. And I think Susan may have mentioned something along those lines too. So if you have a group of 90 students for your synchronous session, you might do it twice with groups of 45 students each. Yeah, I realized what I'm saying is more work for you as a teacher, but I think there's a big payoff in terms of student engagement that you lose when you have the 90 students. The other thing that I forgot to mention earlier that had planned to was something about using quizzes. I know Alberto mentioned this. I know that Margaret mentioned quizzes as well, but I think quizzes are really a great way, whether you assign some credit for the quizzes, which I do, but I do it in such a way that if a student gets 75% of the quizzes correct, they get the full credit. So, I lowered the bar. If I was doing this in a classroom, I typically draw that line at 80%. I've lowered it a little bit, but I'm doing it more to make sure that they're really keeping up with the material. So they can't get a 75% overall if they're not keeping up with the material. So that's another way of trying to keep students engaged throughout the semester.
Okay, thank you, Peter. All right, so there was a couple of questions I'll quickly bring forward. One of them is about how are discussion boards different than Zoom chat? So discussion boards are available through your learning management system. So some of you might be familiar with the old one on Twin, but whether it's Canvas, Blackboard, or others, you may have discussion boards available. There also is someone who's answered that on the Zoom as well. Another observation relates to calling on people cold in a large class. And the question that's posed, is that somewhat chaotic? I've done it in a class of 50 to 60. And one reason I do it is to let people know that that's a possibility and keep them reading and engaged. And it has worked. Occasionally you will call on somebody and no, there's not a response. And that actually then is going to lead to our next discussion, which is communicating with students. Because if I've called on someone and they're nowhere to be found, they quickly get an email from me. So anyone else want to say anything about calling on students in large classes?
I just want to say two really quick things. One, of just echoing what Peter said, I actually have broken my synchronous sessions. I know my PR class is asynchronous, but I've taught synchronously this last year, other classes, into groups of 25 so I can see all of them on my screen. Even though it's shorter, that way I can see them. And also when I call on them, I see all the people I'm going to be calling on. I do require cameras on, but I also, like Alberto, tell them, if you have an issue, email me in advance, and I will, of course, allow you not to, basically, if there's a problem. And the other thing I would like to say engagement-wise is that I found really useful with synchronous is to use the whiteboard feature on Zoom and actually use it like a chalkboard. And I just got my teacher evaluations from this last semester, and I had several students say I was the only teacher who did that. Everyone else used PowerPoints, but they loved seeing in real time me putting up notes. That was more what they were used to. And I know not everyone would love to do that, but it's a way of them staying engaged because they don't know what you're going to write. They're kind of watching what you're doing. I do cold call on students, but again, I can see them because I broke it down into groups of 25.
So anyone else on that?
Can I add a couple of things? I forgot the whiteboard. I did use the whiteboard. I used the whiteboard to draw more than to write because I have to use the mouse and that's kind of awkward. But the students like the drawings every now and then. Back to the discussion forums. Two things. One, in my case, the discussion forum is a function of the learning management system. In Blackboard, you can add discussion forums, and depending on how you structure your homepage, you can add it to each class. You can have a discussion forum for each class, which is what I do. And I tell the students that's your opportunity to engage or that's an opportunity to engage in discussion with each other. You just do it in writing instead of in the class. The other thing about discussion forums, when we are preparing discussion forums, if we are going to, I tell the students that they can post anything they want. They can start a discussion. It doesn't happen very often, but they have in the past. But when we try to start discussions, remember, the only thing that I'm going to say about that is that remember that the type of question matters, because if it's a question where there's an answer, like it's a final exam type hypo where either there is this is the analysis and so on, that's not going to generate a lot of discussion probably. The answer is either right or wrong. Or almost right or almost wrong. The better questions to use for discussion forums are questions that are opinion type questions, where people would have different opinions, and they want to engage with each other as to why they believe in one thing or another, whether something's a good idea or a bad idea, and so on. That's that.
Thank you. So quickly, I'm going to make some comments about communication as an area of best practices. I think the best way of summarizing it is that communication really needs to be intentional. You don't have the spontaneity you may have in terms of running into students in the hall and otherwise connecting. And so the idea is to figure out ways to connect. And so one way is that if you're teaching through Zoom in a synchronous class, then to sign on early, allow the students to talk to you and each other, introduce their pet, their new child, whatever it may be, to stay on Zoom. Another thing to keep in mind is the importance of having some kind of office hours that you post and keep, even if people don't show up, that there's value there, but you always should give them the option of also making another appointment if they're not available at the designated time. Another thing is to really think about emails that you get and to try to respond to them if at all possible that day, because this is your connection. This electronic tether is what's going to keep you basically in touch with your students. And from that standpoint, I can say that the best thing I did, and I probably mentioned it in August that I was going to do it, was to meet individually with the students. And you know that in larger classes, that was incredibly time consuming. I had heard about it on an ALS webinar last summer, and the professor did 15 minutes. And that's when I said, oh, that's not long enough. I'll do a half hour. Well, the half hour ate up a good part of my September in a class of, two classes of 40 to 60 people each. But it's the best thing I did. One reason we're in teaching is we love our students. And it was the way that you really got to know your students, and not randomly. You get to know each of them, at least for that 30 minutes. And it's something I intend to do after we go back to live teaching, in-person teaching, should I say. So quickly, Susan, is there something else in terms of communication?
No, I think I think I'll cover my point there in the next.
Okay, so really an important part of this, and we don't have much time left, we only have 12 minutes, but some questions have come up related to expectations and assessment. And so that's our next section. And Susan, you're our lead on that.
Yeah, I've already made this point, but I just want to make it again, which is the importance in light of some of the communication problems that Susan just mentioned, or the challenges of communication. It's so important to be very clear, very transparent, stable in your expectations, make it clear how you're going to assess students, give them multiple opportunities to practice the skills that you are going to assess in the final summative assessment, and to avoid it's so easy to post and that kind of thing. When you're doing online teaching, it's important to realize that even though it's easy for you to change an assignment or post it at the last minute, that does not mean that it's easy for the students to absorb it at the same rate that you are able to post. So again, less is more, and also long lead times are really important, and staying stable in what you ask and your methods of assessment and your expectations for each class. This, to us in my law school as a vice dean, this is the number one source of complaints from students about faculty during our online teaching experiment. So, and I think that we had a couple other things. Margaret, did you want to add a couple of other points?
Yeah, sure. Just quickly. First of all, one of the things that we talk about having all of these formative assessments, which I do way more formative assessments, meaning just any assessment before the final, basically, whether graded or just for completion, than I would in an in-person class, because that's really how I get feedback and know what they're doing. And first of all, there's a plus to that because students can actually practice what they're going to be doing on the final exam all semester long if you are giving them feedback to it. Now, if you're not giving them feedback, then they don't know if they're doing a good job or not. So again, feedback is kind of important, but you really have an opportunity to have way more formative assessments, and students do generally appreciate that, especially if there's good feedback on them. The other thing is I actually count into their grade every single formative assessment they do. Even if it's a quiz, it's only 3 questions long. They get some credit for it. So that way they feel like, this is going towards my grade and it's not just something that they want me to do for nothing. So while in my in-person classes, I basically have, 85% of the grade goes to the final or more. For my asynchronous courses, only about 60% goes towards the final. And then the other 40% I divvy up into, 5 or 10% for the quizzes. And then another little portion for assignments, another little portion for their discussions, so that every single little thing they do at least goes into that. And students appreciate that being graded. Now, some of that is just for completion. I don't give real feedback. If you do it, you get the points. But even for the ones for completion, if I can comment on them, I try to comment on everything they submit.
I do that too. Just one other point to add here, which is I have never done this before, but this year I did refer explicitly to ABA Standard 310 to explain to students this is how the ABA thinks you're earning credit, and this is how much out of class time you should be doing, how much in class time there should be. So to help minimize complaints about too much work, because we were getting those. And I have also set many faculty members to look at that standard so they are not overdoing it in terms of the amount of work that they're assigning.
So as we're talking about assessment, engagement, one of the chat questions asks each person to describe some specific exercise that has worked particularly well, some exercise or assessment that you think has worked particularly well when it comes to teaching in the virtual classroom. So Margaret, what would you start with? You described some, but other than ones you've already described, are there others?
Well, I use discussion questions, which is different than a discussion list. It's where I post a question, and in law, it's typically a hypothetical, and then I've broken the class up into little groups, so they're each in a discussion group, and they respond to it, and they see the other students' responses to it. And then after everyone's responded to it, I then respond to it and give basically what I would say is as close to a correct answer as possible, but also indicate areas where there's multiple possible points of interpretation. But that works really well. And then I individually respond to each student's post. So if they've made some errors in their analysis, I can point that out to them. And
so Peter, what would you say is an exercise that has worked particularly nicely?
I mean, we've already discussed it. I think quizzes really are good. I structure them as MPRE type questions. And so the students are getting it, and part of my final includes the same type of questions. So if I see a student who isn't performing well after the first couple quizzes, I'll meet separately with that student and try to analyze what the issue is. Quite often the issue isn't not knowing the material, but it's not doing well with that type of question. And I'll try to, point out some of I guess, do a diagnosis about how that student can improve.
Susan, Carl?
Yeah. So I'll give one example. I had the head of our student disability law society came to me to complain about an adjunct who was insensitive around disability issues, and also to say she felt that our legal ethics curriculum didn't include enough about disability rights and about Model Rule 1.114. And so I said, great, why don't you develop some content? So she and Bob Dinnerstein, our now acting dean and international expert on disability law, and another junior faculty member, and I put together the beginnings of a role play scenario involving disability rights, a set of disability rights issue that I had recently done some consulting on for the National Disability Rights Network. And we videotaped it and we posted it as an async assignment. And I got the most thoughtful reflection answers to this. So we set it up, here's the problem, and we're in a law firm, we're trying to figure out what to do. And then we turned to the camera and said, so, you're here with us, figure out what the answer is. And we got just wonderful responses, or I got them because I used it in my class. So it goes to the theme of use your students to help you generate content.
Alberto, is there something you would share that you haven't mentioned so far?
Yeah, two things. One we have mentioned, and is the not very innovative, but tried and true method of just using quizzes and questions for the students to assess themselves. But the important thing there is to provide feedback. If you prepare a set of multiple choice questions, make sure you provide the way for them to see what would be the correct answer and why it would be the correct answer, and also why the other ones would be incorrect. And many programs allow you to do that. Blackboard as a learning management system allows you to do that. And if you use Google Forms, again, it allows you to do that. So that's really easy. Another one that is more innovative and that I haven't had a chance to use, but I know colleagues who use it and I haven't had a chance to use it because it involves a program that I haven't figure out how to use. And that is to, when you do short or long, whatever, pre-recorded lectures, you can embed quizzes within the lecture so that the students have to actually answer a question before they can move on and to continue to watch the lecture. And that works really well once you learn how to use it and how to construct. That takes some time, but once you do that, it works really well. And I know that there's a program called Panopto that allows you to do that. That may be available to some schools and to some of the management systems.
Thank you, Alberto. Well, time flies when you're having a good time. We all miss our PR friends and hope that in the near future we will see one another in person soon. I just want to thank you all for participating in this session. In particular, I want to thank the panelists. I know that many of them will share with you information that they have and different problems and exercises that they have mentioned. For example, there's already been a request for the disabilities problem that Susan Carl developed. So keep that in mind. I asked each person for a takeaway, but we only have a minute left. So I think instead of that, I'll just encourage people to stay in touch with one another. And I hope that this session on best practices not only helps you with your online teaching, but also gives you some ideas for once we return to our, what they call the brick and mortar classroom. So thank you for being here and wishing you the best semester and new year.
That's right. Thanks. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. And thank you, Renee, out there for sponsoring this.
Yes, thanks to the section.
Thank you.